Ontology is the study of things that exist in general. It doesn't consider whether or not your phone exists, or this couch exists, or maybe a particular tree outside exists. Instead, it considers things existing in general, like does space exist or time exist? How about concrete or spatial objects? Maybe there are immaterial objects out there. Do those types of things exist? And even considers whether or not things like numbers or possible worlds exist. As a discipline, though, ontology is sometimes thought to be trivial. That is, we don't really need anyone studying ontological questions, and the reason for that is because those questions are easily answered. In this video, I want to explore this idea, and I want to explore it in a particular way. I want to explore it by looking at the ontology of abstract objects. So the place to start is to think about three different attitudes we might have towards whether or not abstract objects exist. The first might be they do exist. Things like numbers and possible worlds and properties exist, and the answers to which ones exist are relatively trivial. It doesn't really require any deep thought or hard effort to figure out whether or not numbers exist or not. The second attitude might be abstract objects do not exist, and it's trivial to show that they don't exist. We don't require any sophisticated arguments to show which ones exist or don't exist. Instead, we have relatively simple arguments that show that no abstract objects exist. The third attitude is whether or not they exist or not is a hard question, and we need individuals working hard to figure out whether they do or they don't exist. It's not something that we can just glance at and determine straight away whether or not things like numbers exist. So these are three different theories that might be undertaken, and in this video I only want to focus on one. I want to focus on a view I'm going to call permissivism. And I'll define permissivism as follows. It's this first position I outlined, which is abstract objects exist, and it's relatively trivial to show how they do exist. That is, we can easily show which ones do and don't exist, and so we don't need ontologists or philosophers trying to figure out the answers to these questions because there's a relatively simple procedure for doing so. But before we dive into all that, I want to at least define what an abstract object is before we start talking about whether they do or don't exist. I'm going to use the definition that it's an abstract object or entity, or what might be called abstracta, is anything that is said to exist but doesn't actually exist in space and time. So something outside of space and time that might exist or is a candidate for existence. So let's look at some examples of abstract things. The first example would be mathematical entities, things like numbers or geometric shapes. So a circle, we might find various circles in nature, but the mathematical circle is not something I think anyone has ever found in nature, because actual circles, no matter how circular they are, have minor imperfections. A second item that could be considered an abstract entity are properties, especially properties that are general in nature. I might have various concrete characteristics that you can point to and say, oh, look at all the features and properties that you have. But once we start talking about properties in general, that is tallness, something that we can share, then we are talking about something abstract. It's not something localized in me, but it's a feature that multiple people can partake in. A third example would be collections, or any case where some entity is greater than the whole of its parts. So you exist, I exist, maybe our neighbors exist, but something like a community understood as being larger than the sum of its parts might be said to be something that's abstract. An individual that doesn't believe in abstractions or abstract things might just say, communities are just the people in them. There's nothing more to it than that. But once you start talking about teams or collections of people that somehow it's larger than the sum of its parts, then maybe you're talking about something that's an abstract entity. A fourth example would be general things. So for example, take a word. Of course, there are tokens or specific concrete instances of words that we find on pieces of paper or people speak them, but the word itself isn't exhausted by those finite number of concrete instances that you find in a dictionary or a book. We talk about the type the, And then we also talk about specific instances of that are found in the world. Some people consider propositions or the meanings of sentences to be abstract entities. So there's not only the sentences, but also what the sentences express. But what they express sometimes isn't tangible. It isn't something that we can hold on to. It's an idea or a meaning that is not found in space and time, and so it would be considered an abstract entity. The last type of thing that might be considered an abstract entity are possible worlds. I might say, hey, it's possible that I could lift 500 pounds. Well, I'm not saying I can lift 500 pounds, I'm just saying it's possible. Well, in order to make sense of this, we might say, well, what this would mean is that there's some possible world out there that I'm stronger and do lift 500 pounds. This would be a reference to some abstract entity that would make sense of what I'm saying here.
What is this? A blank world?
Now that we have a definition of abstract entities and we have some examples, now let's dive into the position I want to investigate further, which is permissivism. And we've defined permissivism already, but what we haven't done is really think about why anyone would ever accept this permissivist view. Well, the answer to it, the answer why people would say, yes, abstract entities exist, and it's relatively trivial to figure out which ones do exist and don't exist, is relatively simple to state. To see how, consider this sentence. There exists a number that is the sum of 1 plus 1. Now, would you say that this is true or false? Well, I think most of you would say, yes, this sentence is true. There does exist a number that is the sum of 1 plus 1, and that number is 2. Well, what have you committed yourself to here? What have you committed to actually existing in the world, that is, saying that exists, in order to make this sentence true? Well, what it looks like you've done is commit yourself to the existence of an abstract entity, namely a number. Because you say there exists a number that is the sum of 1 plus 1, and so when I ask you, well, what makes that sentence true? Well, you say, well, the number 2 makes it true. And I'm saying, so you are saying that the number 2 exists? And you say, well, yeah, I guess so. The number 2 does exist and it's the sum of 1 plus 1. We can do this for a number of other abstract entities. Let's take the proposition, there exists a property that you and I both share. If you say that this sentence is true, then I'm going to respond by saying, well, what makes it true? Well, you would respond by saying, there must exist a property that we both share, being human, or being kind, or being smart, or having a nice smile, some property that we both share. Well, in saying that there exists such a property, you've committed yourself to, again, the existence of an abstract entity. Let's go back to possibilities. Let's say I assert there exists a possibility that I could have been 1 millimeter taller. And you say, yeah, you're not saying anything crazy here. You're just saying you could have been 1 millimeter taller. And so then I'm going to respond, if I'm a permissivist, well, what makes that sentence true? And you would say, well, I guess the truth maker is the existence of a possibility or a possible world where you are actually 1 millimeter taller. The strategy then is straightforward. We can determine what types of abstract entities exist simply by running through all of the true sentences that involve reference to an abstract object. And since those sentences refer to those abstract objects need to exist in order to make the sentence true. Returning to an earlier example, when I say there exists a number that is the sum of 1 plus 1, and you say, yes, this sentence is true, well, when we try to figure out what makes it true, it looks like we are committed to the existence of numbers. There are 2 points of clarification that I want to make. The first point of clarification is that we're only reading off the true sentences. We wouldn't read off false sentences to determine what entities exist. So if I said there exists a number that is both odd and even, we would say that this sentence is false. And so we wouldn't read off that sentence to the existence of some abstract entity, which is a number that has the property of being both odd and even. We're only reading off true sentences to the existence of abstract entities. The second point I want to make is that it's not strictly easy to determine which abstract entities exist But we don't need any kind of special philosophical or ontological work in order to do this. The real difficulty associated with determining which abstract entities exist is simply found in determining which of the sentences are true. But this can be done by mathematics and the empirical sciences. Those disciplines determine which sentences are true, and the philosophical project is easy. We simply read off those sentences to determine what entities exist and what entities don't exist. In short, what the permissivist is saying is not that it's easy to determine which abstract entities exist, it's just easy to do the philosophical work associated with determining which abstract entities exist. What I want to look at next is one argument against permissivism. And this argument against permissivism has a name. It is called the paradox of non-self-instantiation. There's a number of different ways of expressing this particular paradox, but the way I'm going to look at is found in Nick Effingham's book, An Introduction to Ontology, and I'll put a link in the description below to this book.
Are you ready? All right.
This particular argument has two stages. In the first stage, what I'll show is that if permissivism is true, then the property of being non-self-instantiating exists. In the second stage, what I'll show is that the property of being non-self-instantiating cannot exist. And so this will lead us to the conclusion that permissivism is false. Let's start with some terminology. There are properties that I have, and there are properties that I do not have. I have the property of being 6 foot tall, I have the property of being male, I have the property of being a nice person, at least I hope. And then there are properties that I lack. I lack the property of being capable of lifting 600 pounds. I lack the property of being taller than the tallest building, and there are many others. When I have a property, we can say that I instantiate that property. And more generally, when an object has a property, we say that that object instantiates that property. It's a representation or an actual concrete instance of that property in the world. When you lack a property, we say that you do not instantiate that property. That is, you are not a concrete representation of that property in the world. So we've shown that objects can instantiate properties. I can instantiate the property of, let's say, wearing a blue shirt or being 6 foot tall or being nice, but also properties can instantiate properties. Take the property of being red. Well, this particular property instantiates the property of being a color. We say that red is a color. It has the property of being a color. Another property that instantiates a property is being sad. You can say, well, being sad instantiates the property of being an emotion. It is a concrete instance of that particular property. One proposition that we can assert is that every property instantiates at least one property, and that is the property of being a property. In other words, take the property of being red. Not only does it instantiate the property of being a color, but the property being red also instantiates the property of being a property. Same thing with being sad. It also instantiates the property of being a property, and being tall instantiates the property of being a property. So to rephrase this, or to summarize it, we'd say that all properties instantiate the property of being a property. The next thing I want to point out is that some properties can actually instantiate themselves. When a property instantiates itself, we call it a self-instantiating property. One property that instantiates itself is the property of being a property. So take the property being a property. Well, that property is itself a property, and so it instantiates itself. We can predicate of being a property that it is a property. But of course, not all properties instantiate themselves. When a property does not instantiate itself, then we say that that property has the property of being non-self-instantiating. Let's think of an example. An example might be the property of being even. Well, we say that positive integers instantiate the property of being even, because to be even is to be divisible by 2. But think about the property itself of being even, which is the property of being divisible by 2. Well, we would say that this particular property doesn't instantiate itself because the property of being divisible by 2 isn't itself divisible by 2. It's only integers that are divisible by 2, not properties. Maybe a more, concrete example would be the property of being angry. Well, we would say when individuals feel a certain way, they have a certain group of emotions as well as behaviors, then they instantiate this property of being angry. But we wouldn't say that being angry is itself angry, that is, being angry is itself has the property of being angry. So the thing to point out is that we can assert certain sentences, which is that there exists a property of non-self-instantiation, and we would say that this property applies to a number of properties. And so if we're a permissivist, we would say that this property actually exists. So what we've argued here at the end of stage 1 is if permissivism is true, then the property of non-self-instantiation exists.
Round 2. Fight!
Now we're moving to stage 2. In stage 1, we show that if permissivism is true, then the property of non-self-instantiation exists. In stage 2, what we'll show is that the property of non-self-instantiation cannot exist. And this will lead us to our conclusion that permissivism is false. The argument for this can be a little bit tricky, and so I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the argument, and then we'll go through it step by step. This is the argument. Take the property of being non-self-instantiating. Now that property, since permissivist says that it exists, either instantiates itself or it doesn't. If it instantiates itself, then it doesn't instantiate itself, which is contradictory. If it doesn't instantiate itself, then it does instantiate itself, which is also contradictory. Since both of these options lead to contradiction, the property of being non-self-instantiating cannot exist. And if it cannot exist, then permissivism is false. Now let's break this argument down into its parts. The first place to start is with a classical law of logic called the law of excluded middle. The law of excluded middle says that every proposition of the form P or not P is true. When we take that idea and apply it to instantiation, we are saying that every abstract object either instantiates a property or it doesn't instantiate that property. So some examples. Let's say I have a pancake. Well, I would say that this particular pancake either instantiates the property of being edible or it doesn't instantiate that property. Or I might say John either instantiates the property of being a rabbit or he doesn't instantiate this property. Not only does the law of excluded middle with respect to instantiation apply to objects, but it also would apply to properties. Take the property of being red. This particular property either instantiates the property of being a color or it doesn't. Given the law of excluded middle, we would say that this either-or sentence must be true. Now we can apply this particular idea to the property of being non-self-instantiating. So we would say that the property of being non-self-instantiating either instantiates itself, that is, it's self-instantiating, or it doesn't, that is, it's not self-instantiating. So according to the law of excluded middle, for the things that exist, this sentence must be true. So let's consider this particular proposition. First, let's suppose that the property of being non-self-instantiating instantiates itself, that is, it's self-instantiating. If the property of being non-self-instantiating instantiates itself, then what does it instantiate? Well, it instantiates non-self-instantiation, in which case it doesn't instantiate itself. In other words, if the property of being non-self-instantiating instantiates itself, then it doesn't instantiate itself. But this is inconsistent. It can't instantiate itself and not instantiate itself at the same time. But let's go back to our original sentence now. We said that the sentence, the property of being non-self-instantiating, either instantiates itself or it doesn't. Well, we found out that if we assume that it instantiates itself, this leads to contradiction. So it must be the case that the property of being non-self-instantiating does not instantiate itself. So let's consider that option. So if we suppose that being non-self-instantiating does not instantiate itself, well, what do we find? What we find is that if being non-self-instantiating doesn't instantiate itself, then it has the property of being non-self-instantiating. That is, by non-self-instantiating, it actually instantiates itself. In short, just to boil it down, if the property of being non-self-instantiating does not instantiate itself, then it does instantiate itself. What's the result? The result is, if the property of being non-self-instantiating exists, then it's false to say that the property either instantiates itself or it doesn't. But this would violate the law of excluded middle, which many people think holds true for all propositions. Rather than reject the law of excluded middle, this proposition that says all sentences of the form P or not P are true, instead we reject that this particular property exists. We say that the property of being non-self-instantiating must not be a real thing.
Oh, sorry, I was spacing out. Would you mind just summarizing everything you just said?
Let's go back to our argument, and I want to boil it all down into a more codified, or what's sometimes called standard form. Here's the argument against permissivism. Premise 1. If permissivism is true, then the property of being non-self-instantiating exists. Premise 2. If the property of being non-self-instantiating exists, then the property either instantiates itself or it doesn't instantiate itself. Premise 3. If it does instantiate itself, then it doesn't. Premise 4. If it doesn't instantiate itself, then it does. Intermediate conclusion, or like the halfway conclusion that we draw from this, it is false that the property of non-self-instantiating exists. And so given the first premise, which was if permissivism is true, then the property of non-self-instantiation exists, the conclusion would be permissivism is false. So let's go back to the start. So some people might think the business of ontology is a joke. There's no real work that needs to be done. It's a trivial matter to determine what types of things in general exist. And one group of those individuals we might call permissivists. And the permissivists will say, at least with respect to abstract objects exist. Of course, we have an easy way of determining which ones exist and which ones don't exist. And they look at the true sentences that have reference to abstract objects, and they read off those sentences to determine which abstract objects exist and don't. There's no real hard work that needs to be done. But what I've shown here is that this particular theory doesn't seem to work. Provided you hold the law of excluded middle, provided you don't think that it's false, or at least not false here, then it looks like the permissivist view commits you to this property of being non-self-instantiating, and this property of being non-self-instantiating cannot exist. And so it's committed to an absurdity or an inconsistency. And so any theory that leads to inconsistency, we should chuck the theory rather than say, there are true contradictions out there. What this doesn't actually show, at least this video here, is that ontology isn't trivial, because there is definitely the other option. The other option is to say that abstract objects do not exist, and it's trivial to show how they don't exist. There's some easy arguments to show that such things aren't found in the world. We don't have to be committed to them.